The Kamakura period in Japan was a tumultuous time. The shogunate system had been established, social order was changing, religions were evolving, stories of heroism and philosophy were being written, trade was flourishing, and the Mongols were invading. From the Genpei War that ushered it in to the Genko War that wiped it out, to all the wilderness in between, here's what life was like in Kamakura, Japan. Samurai in debt. Many historical accounts that blend fact and fiction give us a glimpse into the mindset of the Japanese people during the rise of the shogunate system. The islands were going through a reshuffling of spirituality and religion, the class system. One of the most crucial elements as far as the economy and political system was concerned was the rise of the samurai. But it wasn't all noble wars and menacing stances behind raised katana blades. They had to deal with bureaucracy too. And they also had to deal with bankers. You gotta deal with bankers. With the Genpei War in the rearview mirror, Minamoto Yoritomo and the Minamoto clan took the reins of Japanese governance. They established the Kamakura shogunate, shifting power from the imperial court in Kyoto to their base in Kamakura. It marked the beginning of a military government system where the shogun, who was basically a military dictator, held the real political power. The emperors of the period were relegated to symbolic figureheads. The Kamakura shogunate allocated land to samurai warriors in return for military service. The samurai became vassals of the shogun and were granted land revenues known as stipends. Over time, these stipends became hereditary, and samurai began to identify more with their local lands than with the central authority. This led to the rise of powerful local lords, or daimyo, who had their own vassal samurai. With the establishment of Japanese feudal estates, there was a decline in the direct collection of crops as tax, usually rice. Instead, it became pretty common for taxes to be paid in cash. At the same time, trade, both domestic and foreign, started to take off. Ports were bustling, ships were coming to and from China, Southeast Asia, and the Korean peninsula filled with ceramics, silk, precious metals, and spices. But with the monetization of the economy, there was still a growing need for cash. This environment paved the way for the rise of moneylenders. They initially emerged to support the growing commerce, but soon found a lucrative business in lending to the samurai class. Despite being warriors and landowners, many samurai weren't nearly as skilled at managing their finances as they were with a katana blade. The samurai needed cash for a lot of different reasons. They had to outfit themselves for war and fun ceremonies. Who was going to pay for that? They also had to maintain what had become a quite luxurious standard of living. They often turned to moneylenders for loans, using their land as collateral. Due to high interest rates and the samurai's inability to repay, many of them gradually became deeply indebted to these moneylenders. Over time, many samurai lost their land rights to the banks. As a result, the moneylenders, many of whom were from lower social classes, gained a whole lot of influence and power. The rise of moneylenders and the indebtedness of the samurai class blurred the lines of traditional and social hierarchies. Samurai, who were traditionally at the top of the social order, found themselves economically subordinate to moneylenders from lower classes. This situation would set the stage for future conflicts between the samurai and the shogunate itself, instability that would eventually contribute to more civil war and the eventual downfall of the Kamakura shogunate. Divine winds and things that go boom. There's a legend that sometime in the early 1300s, a Japanese merchant made his way to China to trade. Now, we don't know what Hayashi Hideyoshi was looking to trade. Maybe he had copper, a valuable commodity in China that they use for coins. Maybe he was looking for some of that famous Chinese silk to bring back to his homeland. While he was sitting around in the port, or maybe while walking along in a market somewhere nearby, someone showed him a miraculous substance. It was a grainy powder that, when lit, exploded like magic. He asked the vendor what this mysterious stuff was, and the vendor told him it was this new thing called gunpowder. Amazed, Hideyoshi learned how to manufacture it and brought it back with him to Japan. Now the thing is, we don't know this actually happened. By most accounts, it was the Mongols who brought gunpowder over to Japan, and they didn't bring it as a gift. In 1267, a messenger from Goryeo, the modern-day Korean peninsula, walked into the court of Hojo Tokomune, the Kamakura shogun ruling the country at the time. He presented the warlord with a letter from none other than Kublai Khan. It was kindly suggesting that Japan start paying tribute or else. The letter ended with a not-so-veiled threat, and it went, "But now, under our sage emperor, all under the light of the sun and the moon are his subjects. You stupid little barbarians, do you dare to defy us by not submitting?" Tokamune read the letter and then promptly crumpled it up in a ball, threw it in the trash, and then ran the messenger through with a sword. Alright, while that last part probably didn't happen, we do know that Tokamune didn't like the letter much. He ignored it. The Mongols sent 6 diplomatic missions to Japan between 1266 and 1273. The Japanese turned their noses up to all of them. So in 1274, Kublai Khan decided he'd seen enough. He'd just inherited a shiny new navy from the conquered Song dynasty, and he sailed it towards Japan. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in history up until that point. From the Japanese coast, approximately 2,000 boats emerged on the horizon. From the shores of Dazaifu, one of Japan's most strategic cities on the island of Kyushu, the Japanese samurai watched in horror as the fleet pulled into the bay. They were met with a firestorm. Mongol catapults flung ceramic jars filled with gunpowder at the fortifications, but the samurai fought back bravely, using their own war technology, fire arrows. The arrows exploded against the ships and set many on fire. Some say these arrows were so effective because their tips contained gunpowder. Did the Japanese have the mysterious merchant Hideyoshi to thank? But the samurai's arrows were not enough to stop the Mongols. After only one day of battle, the Japanese had lost a third of their forces. But then they got lucky. The Mongols decided to hold off on a full-fledged invasion until the next day. That night, a storm swept in. It's thought that nearly half of their fleet just up and vanished. The Japanese call it the kamikaze, or divine wind, that saved them from a gruesome end. Tokamune's Katsu. So the Mongols left. Back in Kamakura, Shogun Tokamune was wiping the sweat from his brow and putting on a new pair of underwear. In the midst of the invasion, when it looked like Japan might become part of Greater Mongolia, Tokamune had met with his Zen master, Buko Kokushi. Buko Kokushi was maybe the most Zen of the Zen Buddhists. There's a story about him where during the Mongol invasion, he was meditating in front of a Buddha statue in the temple where he was staying. Instead of fleeing, he simply continued to meditate. The temple was assaulted by the Mongols, and when a Mongol soldier drew his sword in front of Buko and was about to make up a former Zen master, Buko looked up at him and said that he had conducted a comprehensive study to seek the real universe and that he had finally got an answer. His answer was this: all is vanity, people are vanity, and even Buddhist teachings are vanity. Now I am spiritually awakened, and so even if you want to kill me with your huge sword, I don't mind. I already know that I am vanity. This means when you swing your sword, you will just cut through a spring wind. The Mongol soldier, impressed and maybe a bit confused, left him alone. Anyway, Shogun Tokamune asked this Buddhist monk what he should do about all the fear and cowardice he was experiencing. Buko told the shogun that he should meditate on it. Apparently, it was deeper than the Mongol threat. Tokamune went and meditated. The sources don't say for how long, maybe it was just a few minutes, maybe a few days. When he met with Buko again, he told the monk that there were big happenings in his life. Buko asked him how he planned to face them, and the shogun yelled, "Katsu." Katsu was like a Buddhist aha. It was a word used when someone found enlightenment. Buko was pleased and told Tokamune that the son of a lion roars like a lion. Tokamune loved that one, and for the rest of his reign, he promoted Zen Buddhism and the code of Bushido throughout Japan. Bushido translates to Way of the Warrior. It was the code of conduct for the samurai that became more entrenched thanks to Tokamune. It was an entire framework for how a samurai should live. Values like frugality, righteousness, courage, benevolence, respect, sincerity, honor, loyalty, and self-control were held up on pedestals. Bushido was steeped in Buddhist traditions and thought. But while it was considered an ethical framework, it wasn't really considered religious. In general, the samurai actually believed they were doomed to the Japanese version of hell, called Jigoku because they were trained to fight and kill. What developed was a very Buddhist state of mind, one where the samurai were said to be unafraid of death. Overcoming the fear of death is a very Zen Buddhist type of practice. The samurai referred to it as the divine shield. It made them formidable warriors who were completely committed to their craft. The idea of the warrior poet, the noble, educated, disciplined fighter, was born. If the divine shield was real, then so were the divine winds, or kamikaze. The Mongols came back 7 years later in 1281. This time they had an even larger fleet. Estimates put this one at between 3,000 and 4,000 ships and over 120,000 soldiers. Once again, fire rained down on Japan. But then once more the divine winds intervened. A typhoon swept through and destroyed the Mongol fleet a second time. Japan was saved. In the aftermath, a group of samurai, we don't know who or where, got together, scratching their heads. They needed a better sword, one that could more effectively cut through the Mongol armor, which their tachi swords were not great at. From the forge, one blacksmith hammered out the first katana. Its less pronounced curve, shorter length, and greater weight made it lethal against Mongol army, really any armor. The Japanese also refined how they heated and reheated the steel. This gave the blades a razor-sharp edge, sturdiness, but also a ton of flexibility. The most iconic sword in the world was born. The samurai who was captured by bandits. Sometime in the beginning of the 13th century, a samurai named Kamakura Japan was riding his horse east through the Japanese countryside. He was riding it backwards though, gazing back towards the west as his horse trotted along. The bandits hiding in the trees ahead were confused by the sight but excited about the potential contents of his purse. Kumagai was riding his horse backwards because he was a Pure Land Buddhist, a new sect of Buddhism that had emerged recently. He tried his best to always face west, towards Jodo, or the land of bliss, where the Bodhisattva Amida lived. It was the purest level of existence, a plan Kumagai hoped to be reborn into if he lived right. The beauty of Pure Land Buddhism was that it did not discriminate. Anyone could be reborn in the land of bliss, from beggars to emperors. Even the bandits hiding in the trees had a shot. It was a radical idea in a land of frigid class structure, and it coincided with a major social and political shift going on in Japan at the time. The samurai, once just low-ranking civil servants with as much power as an unplugged toaster, had risen to become the de facto rulers of the realm. Any commoner who proved himself in battle could potentially rise through the ranks and become someone that history remembered. The Kamakura period was the period of the shogun, where warrior lords dominated the land and developed a code of conduct as lethal as it was poetic. So there was Kumagai riding his horse in a perfectly sensible way, as far as he was concerned, when the group of bandits charged out of the trees. They were wearing worn-out kasodes and had mismatched armor. Some brandished small daggers called tanto, and others had longer swords called tachi, the predecessor of the katana. The bandits captured Kumagai and took him to their camp, where they tied him up and started pummeling him with questions. They wanted to know where he was going and what he was carrying. Kumagai refused to answer their questions, so the bandits started pummeling him instead with fists and the butts of their daggers. Kumagai was nearly beaten senseless, but he refused to give in. He knew that if he gave the bandits any information, they would just kill him anyway. After hours of punishment, the bandits, they finally gave up. They knew that they were not going to get anything out of Kumagai, so they decided to just let him go. He was released, but he was badly injured. He'd been beaten and burned. He was also missing his sword and his armor. Kumagai knew that he couldn't go back to his home in his current state. He'd be disgraced. So he decided to travel to a remote village where he could heal and rebuild his strength. Kumagai traveled for many days, and finally he came to the village. The villagers were surprised to see him, but they took him in and gave him food and shelter. Kumagai stayed in the village for a few months and he slowly recovered from his injuries. While there, he learned the ways of the villagers and he came to appreciate their simple way of life. Money and rank wasn't everything. Winds of Change. This story is a fictionalized account of a very real person. Kumagai Japan was a decorated samurai who fought for the Minamoto clan during the Genpei War, which lasted 5 years from 1180 to 1185 and ushered in the Kamakura period and the reign of the first shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo. There's another story about Kumagai, this one directly from the tale of the Heikei, a historical epic told and retold through Japanese bards about the Genpei War and the clash between the Minamoto and Taira clans. During the war, Kumagai was a killer. He'd killed more Taira warriors than he could count. But one day during a battle on Suma Beach outside the city of Kobe, he had an experience that changed him forever. Kumagai and his Minamoto warriors had the Tairas on the run. They were retreating down the beach, fleeing to their ships harbored just off the coast. But the Minamoto samurai were out for blood. Kumagai spurred his horse on and caught up with a fleeing Taira warrior, who he kicked from his horse and threw to the ground. When he ripped off his helmet, Kumagai realized it was a young Taira prince named Atsumori. The prince was resigned to his fate and growled at Kumagai to take off his head. Kumagai hesitated, though, because Atsumori reminded him of his own son. Tears were welling in his eyes, and Kumagai finally brought his sword down on the prince's neck. Later, as Kumagai sifted through Atsumori's possessions, he stumbled upon a flute named Saida, or Little Branch. Unraveling its history, he learned that it was a treasured gift from Emperor Toba to the Taira leader Tadamori and later handed down to Atsumori. Kumagai was filled with even more sorrow when he found this out. Earlier that day, the hauntingly beautiful notes of a flute had drifted from the enemy lines, touching Kumagai's soul. It dawned on him now that the musician behind that melody might have been none other than Atsumori himself. After the war, Kumagai was filled with regret. He renounced his warrior ways and turned to Buddhism and the teachings of a guy named Honen, who had just started the Pure Land Buddhist sect, hence the backwards horse riding. Kumagai was a changed man, apparently, but would the rest of Japan experience a similar type of enlightenment? The Tengu. None of the Tengu had anything to say about it. Tengu were supernatural beings from Shintoism, Japan's oldest religion. They were mountain spirits that would visit ascetic monks who practiced mountain worship. For these monks, everything in nature had a spirit, or kami, and the mountains were particularly powerful. Tengu were temperamental spirits that could be benevolent or vengeful and take the form of birds or monkeys. But according to the Buddhists who came later, the Tengu were deceitful. They sowed chaos and sparked wars and led monks off their righteous paths. In time, these Buddhist views softened, and the Tengu became more like protectors who would reveal themselves to people high on mountains. But they were still dangerous. By the 14th century, the Tengu started being portrayed like this, all red and angry, with a nose longer than Pinocchio's when he's trying to convince someone he's not made of wood. The king of the Tengu was named Sojobo. According to legend, during the Genpei War, Minamoto Yoshitsune, the brother of future shogun Minamoto Yoritomo, climbed Mount Kurama, a sacred mountain north of Kyoto, and met Sojobo. He trained with the king of the Tengu and became a master of martial arts and learned to jump and run like Neo in the Matrix. His time with the devilish long-nosed mountain spirit king helped prepare Yoshitsune for the Battle of Yashima, one of the final battles of the Genpei War. After decisive naval confrontation at Yashima, the Taira were on the run, and Yoshitsune pursued them. During the chase, Yoshitsune and his men found themselves on the island of Shikoku, trying to cross a narrow strait back to the mainland of Honshu. The Taira, aware of this, turned the tables and started chasing Yoshitsune and his men. Seeing that he was in danger with no time to spare, Yoshitsune made a daring escape by leaping across 8 tethered boats to reach the safety of the other side. Thanks, Sojobo. The monk who brought tea to Japan. In 1187, a Buddhist monk named Asai sailed to China to study under a Zen master there. For 4 years, Asai meditated in the gardens of the temple grounds. He studied the way of Zen, a stripped-down version of Buddhism that cast away scriptures and ceremony and focused instead on more direct methods for attaining enlightenment. He pondered koans, paradoxical thought experiments used to challenge the logical, discursive mind and bring about direct insight. "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" asked the master, and Asai sat and meditated on it for a while. My head would have exploded. During his time in China, Asai also discovered tea. He loved the stuff so much that when he sailed back to Japan in 1191, he brought bags of seeds with him. Asai would go on to found the Renzai school of Zen Buddhism and build the Kennenji Temple in Kyoto, where he started cultivating tea. He wrote a book called the Kissa Yajoki, which translates to Drinking Tea for Health. In it, he extolled the virtues of tea. It could be used to help monks stay alert while meditating. It could be used as medicine to cure all kinds of ailments. There's a story where he gave some tea to a hungover shogun, along with his new book, and the shogun was impressed. Hungover, you say? Some of you guys need this tea. The leaf started spreading throughout Kamakura, Japan. The roots of tea ceremonies, or chanayu, started to develop. As the drink became more popular, the nobility and the samurai class started drinking it. They would hold events called tocha, or tea tasting competitions where competitors would gather and try to guess the origins of different teas. It became quite the event. The host would invite a group of guests, probably Kamakura A-listers, and they would be presented with 10 cups with 4 different types of tea in them, a procedure called 4 kinds and 10 cups. The nobles and samurai would make their guesses of what was what, and the winners would get prizes like silk, weapons, and jewelry. Alcohol was often added to the mix, and everyone had a good time. But for Asai, tea was not a laughing matter. He believed the world was going through something called Mappo, or the latter age of the Dharma, where society was in decline. The volatility of the Genpei War and the social upheaval of the times were concerning to the Zen monk, and he thought tea was a panacea that could help people through the chaos. Nida Yoshisada's seaside gambit. By the turn of the 13th century, things were starting to unravel for the Kamakura shogunate. In a desperate attempt to hold on to power and appease the samurai, Shogun Hojo Sadatoki passed the 1297 Bakufu edicts. Remember how all those samurai became indebted to moneylenders? These edicts forgave some of those debts. The edicts didn't work though. Resentment, disorganization, and growing interclan feuds continued to simmer. Japanese Emperor Go-Daigo was also sick of being a figurehead and wanted to make Japan truly imperial again. By 1333, he had allied with Nida Yoshisada, the leader of the Nida clan, and they lay siege to Kamakura. Kamakura was a formidable target that was protected by geography. On one side, the city was shielded by steep cliffs, on the other, by the sea. Traditional routes of attack were limited, and a direct assault was seen as a death sentence. But Nida, determined and maybe a bit desperate, chose to take the city from the seaside. According to legend, Nida Yoshisada made a bold and symbolic gesture before the assault. He drew his own sword and threw it into the ocean, offering it as a sacrifice to the gods and praying for their intervention. Following his prayer, it's said that the tide receded, exposing the seabed and allowing Nida's forces to march into Kamakura along the shore. Some historians speculate whether this was a miraculous divine intervention or if Nida had been informed of the tidal patterns and simply used his knowledge to his advantage. Regardless of the cause, Nida's forces were able to make their way through the city's defenses. The unexpected path of the attack caught the defenders of Kamakura off guard, and the city fell. The Kamakura period came to a close, one of the most tumultuous and influential eras of Japanese history. Thanks for watching. What other periods of Japanese history do you want to learn about? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.